Hello, and thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Collecting Break Data, Why, How, and What For. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Okay, and today we have about 300 registrants from across the U.S., so welcome everybody. Through the support of the American Waterworks Association, we are able to offer certificates of attendance today for registered attendees. You can receive a certificate if you register yourself, log in, and attend the entire webinar. This webinar has not been submitted to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. You must check with your licensing agency to learn about its criteria, rules, and what you need to do in order to receive credit for your attendance. Again, these certificates are provided through AWWA. For attendees who have an AWWA customer record, your certificate will be uploaded within 30 days of this webinar date. For attendees who do not have an AWWA customer record, you will receive an email from AWWA requesting you to create a record by a specific date to receive your certificate. If you do not create a record, you will not receive a certificate. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to our presenter today, James Markham. James is a research scientist at the University of New Mexico's Environmental Finance Center, Southwest EFC. So James, you should be seeing your pop-up window come up right about now.
Thank you everybody for attending. I am going to start off with a rhetorical question, which I do not expect you to answer. And that is quite simply, does your system have breaks and leaks? You might be one of the small systems that is either very new or doesn't really experience leaks very often. But the fact of the matter is, over time, it certainly will. Basically, all water systems leak to a greater or lesser degree. Now, you might be dealing with small breaks like this, or maybe larger ones. Either way, many of them, if not most of them, are going to be unforeseen. But collecting data about them, I think, can help you spot small problems before they become big ones, and can be useful in a lot of different ways, which some of you who already collect break data may already know, but some of you who don't, hopefully this information will be useful for you. I tend to think of running a water utility a little bit like playing chess. And I don't mean Central Park speed chess. I'm thinking about sort of the long drawn out version. But in this case, it's sort of you against Mother Nature. And unfortunately, most of the pieces and a lot of the board are hidden from you. Chess is one of those games where you need experience. You have to be able to look ahead and work out possibilities and calculate odds. You have to plan, but you also have to take new data in as it develops and react to it, all the while knowing that although individual plans often don't work out, planning in and of itself generally does. And those are the same sort of things that you need to successfully run a utility. Collecting break data lets you gather that information and experience, and one, transfer it to a larger group of people within your own utility for analysis, and possibly even more important, it preserves that data for posterity, for your successors. I would argue that if you aren't collecting and analyzing break data, you're not playing chess, you're probably not even playing checkers, you're playing something more akin to roulette, where you're essentially reacting to things that are happening and potentially making what should be database decisions based on anecdotal evidence, or in a worst case scenario, maybe leaving things to chance. So with that as a little bit of background, as our webinar title indicated, we're going to be talking a little bit about the how, the why, and the what of collecting break data. I'd like to start off with a quote from Albert Einstein. It's a pretty good quote that I think is appropriate to this situation, and that's this. If I had only 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes finding the solution. There's actually no evidence he really said this. It's a misattributed quote, but I think it is a really solid concept for doing this kind of activity in general. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to rearrange the title a little bit and focus on the why first. before we get into the what and the how. So, why should we collect brake data? After all, the important thing is to, fix the brake and get the system back in service, right? And while that is true, there's a lot that you can learn about what's happening in your system from brake data, and it can also help you in a lot of other ways. We collect brake data to solve problems and to answer questions about the system. If you answer the why part of the question before you sit down and develop the path for data collection, storage, and analysis, you will, I guarantee you, have a better outcome, because the why really guides the what and the how. If you can define the operational or managerial or financial problems, issues, questions that you want to answer, first off, you can determine whether brake data is going to help you answer those. And spoiler alert, there's an emphatic yes to that in many cases. But thinking about the information you need before you head out into the field and start collecting it is really important, so that you don't end up going out in the field and only partially collecting what you need. Most of the problems that I think most utilities are trying to solve relate in one way or another to one or more of the following things. The condition of your assets. Brakes viewed over time can give you really good insight into pipe deterioration rates and the factors that are causing it. And brake repairs are one of the few times you actually get to look at the pipe in your distribution site system in situ. Brake data can help you define and track certain aspects of your level of service performance. So, repair time, customer impact, water loss reduction goals, things like that. It can help you with risk analysis, or what we like to call criticality, which is essentially the idea of probability of failure and consequence of failure. Pipes that have broken before are probably more likely to break in the future. When you start collecting data, the more data you get, the more patterns you're going to see about which types of pipes are breaking, which age pipes are breaking, which materials are breaking, which locations are breaking, things like that. It can help you with life cycle costing. I think as engineers, we're really good at figuring out, what a system needs to look like and how much it'll cost to install, but we often don't pay quite as much attention to the long-term costs that are associated with the operations and management of the static parts of our system. I think this is something we're much better at with, pumps and things like that move, but pipes are in the ground, they're hidden, so they're kind of a little bit out of sight, out of mind, but direct and indirect repair costs related to those static infrastructure components can be really, really significant. And you want to have a strategic plan for dealing with that. And since we're talking about money, funding is obviously also a big issue. If you look at your data or your brake data through a cost lens, I think that can really help you get a better picture of your strategic funding needs in terms of operations and maintenance, repair, and then a really big one is for replacement programs. And if those 5 previous slides sound familiar to you, that's probably because you've been to some asset management training. I've basically been talking about sort of the 5 core components of asset management, which we tend to show in a diagram, something like this. We do asset management to improve decision-making, and brake data collection should be done for the same reason. You don't collect the data just to have it. You collect it so that you can use it to make better decisions about how to run and fund your system. And I think that is kind of the big takeaway that I hope everybody gets from this. This is not a purposeless activity, it's a purposeful activity. It's there to help you make better decisions. I have seen situations where a system, for example, made a massive effort to collect the GPS locations of all their brakes, but really didn't think about what they wanted to do with that information before they went out in the field. And what that effectively resulted in was a fairly significant labor expenditure for data that couldn't really be used for anything other than location and maybe a basic frequency analysis. If they'd thought a little bit more and planned a little bit more and decided before they started collecting data what kind of questions they would have answered, they could have done a better job of collecting useful data points about their brakes that they could then use for analysis. So with that sort of general exposition about the whys of collecting brake data, I'm going to talk a little bit about the whats. And by whats, I mean, what attributes do we want to collect? I think the answer to this is fairly simple. It's the attributes that are relevant to whatever question you're trying to answer or whatever problem you're trying to solve. That will vary to some degree, but there are basic data elements that you should, or attributes that you should be collecting about all of your brakes that I think my examples later on will show can be transferred to a lot of different situations. There are some very basic pieces of information that you always want to collect. The location, kind of obvious. A street address is good. GPS coordinates are even better. If you have both, I think that's best. Knowing where something happened is really important. You want to know date information. And not just, when did the break happen? You want to know when was it reported? When was it isolated? When was it repaired? When was it put back into service? Those are different timestamps or date stamps that are not necessarily the same. You really need to actually go more granular than date too. You need to look at the time. For example, if you're trying to do a more in-depth analysis about your reaction time to brakes, or if you're trying to calculate water loss from brakes, you really need fairly accurate timestamps on all of these, because although your repair time might be the difference between when it was reported and when it was put back into service, your water loss calculation might actually be from when it was reported to when it was isolated. Those are often different. So you really need that time element. And you also want that time element so that you can compare that to other time-related data that you're keeping about your system. So for example, if you're trying to figure out whether there's a correlation between pipe bursts and booster pump operation, if you're keeping track of the times that your booster pumps kick into operation and the times that your brake happens, you can compare them and maybe see if there's any sort of a correlation, that maybe your bursts are actually the result of unintended pressure transients. That kind of time information is really useful and can potentially help you modify your operations. This next one is a little maybe less obvious, but I think it's really important to track what led to the discovery of the brake. Is this something that was reported to you by a member of the public, or was this something that your staff found? And not only did your staff find it, but did they find it by driving around and noticing water that was leaking, or was it part of an actual concerted leak detection program or effort? Again, either done by your own folks or perhaps an outside agency. If you can differentiate between reported leaks and found leaks, that kind of information can really help you look at what you're spending on leak detection and determine whether it's cost effective vis-a-vis your losses. And I'm not just talking about the direct financial costs of finding those leaks. I'm also talking about sort of the indirect costs. Are you finding small leaks and repairing them before they become big issues and saving yourself money that way? You really want to pay attention to what kind of pipe you're dealing with and how big is it. I know that most operators have encyclopedic knowledge of their system, but unfortunately in many cases that information doesn't really get documented all that well. When you do repairs, it is a great opportunity for you to verify information about your system, to document whether you're dealing with PVC or asbestos cement or cast iron. This is really important if you're a small system, particularly that doesn't have maps, or maybe you're a large system that's older and your maps are spotty or even non-existent. When you fix brakes, you're actually digging up your pipe. It gives you a chance to look at what's in the ground, and it's a really good opportunity to build up your infrastructure knowledge base or confirm that what you know or what you think you know is what you actually know. You want to document failure modes. It's not just good enough to know that it broke. You really want to know how it broke. Is it a corrosion problem, or is it a blowout? Is it a circumferential crack or a slipped joint? Is it on a main line or a service line? These kinds of information can help you develop patterns. You'll see, and you've probably read lots of information about, brake modes differing between different types of pipe. This kind of information is really, really useful and should be documented. To the extent that you can figure it out, knowing what the cause of a break is and documenting it is really, really useful. Although the costs associated with, let's say, a pipe repair that's due to a corrosion failure or a pipe repair due to an accident might be the same, those two events mean very, very different things in terms of the condition of your system. A repair that is the result of age or poor installation or a manufacturing defect tells you something about the condition of your system. A repair that's due to somebody forgetting to call 811 and digging a hole in your pipe is a different animal altogether. That doesn't necessarily reflect on the condition of your pipe. Yes, you need to track it, but you need to be able to tell that this is an accident-related break, which might be used for risk analysis or something like that. You really want to be able to track what causes are there. You also always want to track what kind of repair was done. This is really, really important. Did you clamp something, or did you replace a piece of pipe? And the reason for this is that when you are collecting brake data, particularly if you're doing it in a spreadsheet or on a GIS map, which I highly recommend, you want to make sure that breaks and leaks are tied not only to specific location, but to specific pieces of pipe. Sooner or later, sections of pipe are going to be replaced, often after multiple failures. And what you want to make sure is that when the pipe section gets retired, that the breaks that are associated with that pipe section also get archived, so that when you're doing analysis, maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years later, you are not associating old breaks with new pipe, because if you do that, you're going to end up with faulty analysis. So this sort of underscores the need for developing asset naming conventions and things like that, so that you can make those connections. And pictures. A lot of folks don't take pictures of their breaks. I think it's a really useful thing to do, and it's a really important thing to do. They give you a snapshot of what's going on in a way that I think a written document often can't. These are some really good pictures that I got courtesy of the city of Virginia Beach. There's a lot of information just in this picture. I can tell where this happened. I've got street signs. I know that there are at least 4 people involved in this repair. I can see 3 of them in the picture, and one guy's vest is in the backhoe. I can tell what pieces of equipment are used. This is all useful costing information. Here's a shot of, another action shot of the repair. I could estimate depth of bury from this, perhaps what kind of pipe is being used. I can see what kind of break I have, all useful information that I can get from pipes, and I can also see what kind of repair was done. Images like this can help you fill in blanks after the fact if your field data collection was less than perfect, and sometimes, particularly if you're a very small system, it's really good to be able to document what's going on, because sometimes these records by themselves can be enough to give you an idea of what's going on. There was a lot of other useful information that was obviously not an exhaustive list of the kinds of attributes that you want to collect, but I think those are some of the important ones. There's plenty of other useful information that we can get either in the field or perhaps back in the office that we can then leverage against field data to do further analysis. Pressure is a really big one, and I realize this is not a normal water pressure gauge because that thing is up somewhere around 280 psi, but if you're trying to estimate water losses, for example, pressure is an element that can be really useful for that. You might need to get that from a hydraulic model or somewhere else, but it's a good piece of information, and if you can incorporate that into your brake data, it can be very useful for you. cost information is really important. There's the obvious repair costs relating to personnel and supplies and equipment. Then there's the less obvious ones like the cost of treating the water that went out the break. And then there's also the costs of ancillary damage, which might be financial, but might also be other kinds of damage. We talk about sort of the triple bottom line of financial, social, and environmental consequences. So, the way you're handling breaks and reacting to them could be affecting perhaps the utility's reputation. Slow repairs might be impacting your water rights allocation, something like that. There are other considerations beside financial ones, and those are factors that you can take into consideration and use your break data to analyze. And again, it's sort of what we refer to in the asset management world as this triple bottom line. And I mentioned this before briefly, but things that can be verified are very important. When you dig a hole in the ground, you often find that although your as-built said X was in the ground, what you actually have there is Y. So if you don't have maps, breaks are a great way to start building them. If you do have maps, your breaks provide you a really good opportunity to verify that your assets are what you think they are, and they also give you the opportunity to document what other assets are nearby. I've got some horror stories about water lines and gas lines that were sitting right next to each other, and the results of not knowing which was which. That's useful information. When you dig a hole, you basically have a chance to be a detective and verify that what you think you know is what you really know. So with that sort of why and some of the what's out there, I'm going to talk about a few examples where break data played a significant role in decision making. So these are my why and what case studies. The first one we're going to talk about is a very basic level of service example. Level of service being the types of service that you want to provide for your customers and how you're going to measure it. This specific instance relates to improved response time. So obviously the particular attribute that we're going to want to be collecting here are date and time. It's fairly simple. So this next map here is some plotted historical data from a system. It's about a year's worth of breaks, color-coded based on response time. So 71% of the breaks were repaired in 24 hours, 12% of the breaks were repaired in 48 hours, 17% were repaired in 72 hours. Now this happens to have been done in a GIS map, but the original data was actually in an Excel spreadsheet. And as long as you could identify the different pieces of pipe and the breaks that were associated with them, you could really do this kind of analysis even in a spreadsheet. And I'm putting this up here to sort of show you two things. One, obviously this can be used to evaluate performance, but it can also be used to set goals. If perhaps in a public meeting, the utility's response time to leaks was brought up by the public, you might want to set yourself a standard. By looking at your break data, you can determine what kind of response time is actually reasonable. Can you set yourself a standard that you can actually hold to? So if your standard happened to be 24 hours, you would meet your goal roughly 70% of the time. On the other hand, if you set yourself a 48-hour goal, the goal would be met 80+% of the time. So the same data can be used both to set goals and to evaluate goals. And also, if you're collecting additional pieces of information, it can help you improve your response and better your goals. The next topic is water loss estimates. If any of you do water loss audits, and some states are requiring them now, this is a side note, a great way to start figuring out what's going on in your system, but this is essentially, if you don't know what I'm talking about, auditing your system to determine how much water you're losing through breaks and leaks and things like that. attributes that are going to help you with that. Obviously, the time element that we talked about before, but if you're keeping track of the type of break, for example, if it's a blowout hole, how big is the hole, and you combine that with pressure, you can use readily available formulas to calculate estimated water loss. So this happens to be one of many. You don't need to write this down. But if I know the pressure in PSI, I can convert that to head. And I can figure out a gallon per minute flow, multiply that times the length of, or the duration of the event, and I've got an estimate of how much water was lost. This is a useful thing, both from an asset preservation standpoint, in this case, the asset being your water, but it's also good if you're doing audits to be able to calculate in water losses based on your break data so that you can determine whether the numbers that are coming out of your water audit actually make sense given what was going on the ground. Moving on to probably the most important piece of this talk, assets. What is the condition of your pipe? By tracking breaks, you are actually tracking pipe condition, or at least a good substitute for that. Most of you have probably seen this sort of condition curve. We use this a lot in asset management. The idea being that when we install something, it's in its best possible condition. And over time, it's going to deteriorate until at some point it reaches its sort of minimum acceptable service level. All of the assets in our system are probably somewhere in this range. The big question is where, and can we act on them before they get to this minimum service level, or worse, before they go past that and go to absolute failure. Collecting break data can really help with this. Here is an example from the Midwest. This is a small town where we took many years worth of break data and just basically broke it up by block. And you can see visually very easily that there are some significant problem areas in general here and in specific in those two locations. The area itself, anecdotally, this entire area that's shown on the map was thought of as a really bad and leaky part of town, but what plotting the actual data does is it shows us that it's actually a lot more restricted than the operators and managers originally thought. Now, this happens to have been done in a GIS system, but again, this could be done in an Excel format as long as you had pipe associated with blocks and addresses associated with the breaks. You could essentially run the same analysis and figure out which blocks are having the biggest problems. You just wouldn't necessarily be able to see where they were without actually drawing it on a map. I'm going to zoom in to our top right corner here and show you another thing. So this is all the breaks on the worst street in the area with the date of the break. Now, they didn't have report time and repair time. All they had was the repair date year. So I couldn't necessarily calculate anything about water loss, but I could take this information and plot it, and I get a scatter graph that looks something like this. Some years I have no breaks, some years I only have one, but in the years that I'm having more breaks, you can see that the frequency is increasing. This is hard analytical data that can be used to direct, a pipe replacement program, whereas before they started actually charting the break data, they knew they had to do replacement in this specific neighborhood, but they did not know where. Criticality, risk analysis. This is the probability of failure and the consequence of failure. You're not going to necessarily know this the first day you start collecting data, but as you develop your store of data about your pipes, you're going to be able to look at least the probability side of things and figure out which pipes, maybe in specific or maybe in general, based on age or install type, whether things are in a low probability of failure or a high probability of failure situation. You can actually supplement your individual, numerical break data, like how many breaks you have, with pictures of what's going on the outside of your pipe and possibly what's going on the inside of the pipe. Endoscopic cameras aren't that expensive anymore. When you've got a hole in a pipe, it gives you an opportunity to stick a camera in there and see what's going on. Or if you replace a section of pipe, you've pulled that out, take a look at it, photograph it before you throw it away. Chances are there is other pipe in your system that is in similar condition, and you can take that specific information and extrapolate across your system and come to some conclusions. And again, this is what I was talking about before. The reason for your failure is really important. On the left-hand side, we've got an issue of probably mischief or possibly deterioration. On the right-hand side, we've got an accident. Both of these involve, hydrant replacements, but the reasons are very different, and those mean different things. And again, I was saying that on day one, unless you are cataloging a bunch of historical data, you're maybe not going to know where the next likely break is going to be. So for example, if this is what you start with, it's hard to predict whether you're going to have another break on this line or not. On the other hand, if you are looking at data like this over time, that gives you a completely different picture of what's going on. And yes, this is an actual line in an actual system, and that's less than a year's worth of breaks. They can be pretty sure that the next break is probably going to happen somewhere to the left side of that screen based on the pattern that's been developing. And again, this is the same system looked at from a bird's eye view, and you can just tell by looking at the break data where your problems are. You've got a fairly wide dispersal of breaks throughout the system, but you've got some real problem areas that probably have different reasons, because those are at least diagrammatically, two different kinds of pipe. But this shows you where to start honing in. By looking at this, you can tell that yes, you're probably going to have to fix another repair here, and you can start thinking about the cost elements of that, and when it's time to fish or cut bait. Do you keep repairing this? Do you pull the plug and replace the pipe? There is no fixed point at which you can say yes, it's time to do that. A lot of factors are going to play into that decision. What's your average break cost? I've seen costs ranging from $300 per break to $3,000 per break. How much money does your system have? Are you in a position to actually make a big capital expenditure or not? But if you're collecting this data and you are costing it, you can use it to forecast both your O&M expenses and your potential replacement costs. And while we're talking about costs, talk a little bit about funding. Effective uses of the budgets that you already have is really important. I briefly touched on this instance before, but the difference between found and reported breaks will let you determine whether you are using your money well. Are the financial impacts of your leak detection programs useful or good? When you're thinking about replacement programs, patterns in your break data can really help you figure out which pipes to attack and in what order. Over time, patterns are likely to develop, and you can use them to make decisions. So as I said, when you're taking stuff out of the ground, look at it, think about it, extrapolate to the rest of your system. I'm going to give you what's probably one of the biggest impacts that I've seen of this nature in the form of some information from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we happen to be located. What you're looking at here is 8 years worth of pipe break data mapped by pipe type. This looks kind of like we would expect it to. There's more breaks closer to the river. That's the older part of town, fewer out in the sides, sort of the northeast quadrant, because it's the newer parts of town. But if you sort of zero in on the information, what you'll see is that most of these breaks are actually in cast iron and steel pipe in the system. It's about a 50-50 split. And that would be great if the ratio of cast iron pipe to steel pipe was equal, but it's not. if you look at the pipe distribution, only about 5% of the system is steel pipe. That's the red pipe here. The blue stuff is cast iron. So what Albuquerque was sitting with was 50% of the breaks that they were responding to being a result of 5% of their system. And they had a long-term pipe replacement program in place, but initially, prior to this study, it was not really that focused. They tended to start at one end of a street and work their way to the other. By doing this analysis, they were able to zero in on A, which type of pipe was causing the most problems, which was the steel pipe, but B, which specific pieces of that pipe were causing the problems, because some of the steel pipe was actually in halfway decent shape. And it's always kind of unfortunate when you start a pipe replacement program and you work your way down the street and you realize that half the pipe you yanked out of the ground could have lasted you another 30 or 40 years. Doing pipe break analysis can really help you avoid that kind of debacle. And in Albuquerque's case, they used that pipe break analysis as part of their asset management plan. They implemented that in 2011, and within 5 years, based on a refocusing of how they were applying their dollars, they dropped their break rate and the associated costs by 45%. This is really dramatic. And what's interesting about this is they were actually replacing fewer linear feet of pipe using the same amount of money, but reducing their overall break rate dramatically. And I expect this to probably go down as more and more of that steel pipe gets pulled out of the system. One last capital improvement planning example, and that relates to a small system that we worked with a number of years back, and they told us that they were going to replace their leaky system. They had put together a $5 million loan package based on a feeling that their system was very, very leaky. I'd like to also point out that this map in the background is on a wall. It's completely analog and is perfectly fine. This would be a great way to track Blake data if they were actually doing that. But if you look at the legend down there, you can see that breaks is not one of the things that was collected. So they were making a $5 million decision based on anecdotal evidence about a set of factors that they were not tracking, their breaks. So what we did is we went through some historical data and were able to dig out location information, the types of repairs that were done. This information basically we got from the contract repair person that they used, and some costs. And when we combined that all and threw it in a map, but again, we could have literally done this on the board that was in the office there. What we found is that the vast majority of the leaks that were giving them the impression that they had a very leaky system were relatively inconsequential service line leaks, and that they had one major problem area, which is up there circled in red. And what this map doesn't really show is that all 5 of those points are actually the same joint. Their real problem was that they had a poorly designed joint that wasn't restrained, and it kept coming apart. They would hire a guy to repair it. He would stick it back together again, and some point down the road it would just pop again. If they had been collecting that break data and looking at it in a systematic way, they never would have had to walk down that $5 million road, because their system was only 20 years old and it was made out of PVC. And as you can sort of see from here, aside from that sort of one cluster, there aren't really a lot of problems there. So by looking at the break data, they took a $5 million incorrect solution to a problem and turned it into a $50,000 correct problem to the solution. They basically got the joint restrained and were able to use some of the extra money to loop parts of their system. So here's a really concrete example of some pretty massive monetary savings that were realized based on just a very small number of attributes that could have been collected and analyzed over time. What you're probably noticing here is that the same attributes are relevant to a lot of different problems. You will be able to leverage the same information a lot of different ways and answer a lot of different questions. So now that we've talked a little bit about the whys and the whats, I'm going to move on to the hows. This is going to be a relatively basic overview. But when you're thinking about gathering and storing data, this is what I want you to think about: a library. Part of the reason that books in a library are relatively easy to find is that the layout is planned. The information architecture is well developed. They don't just stuff new books in there like they might at a used bookstore. There's a system in place that allows new information to come in and be categorized, allows old information to be pulled out. So what I'm saying here is plan ahead and think about not only what information you need, but how you're going to store it. Metaphorically speaking, you want your data to look like this, something that's organized and accessible. You don't want something that's like this, where you have to essentially open each record to figure out what's going on. And I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. And this may be useful for the folks that are only tracking things on paper. This is an example of a great set of data collected by a system about a specific service call. I know what the main was, I know where it was, I know the time it was reported, lots and lots of information. The problem with this is that there is really no way for me to query this data in the format that it's in. So this is actually in a GIS database, which we think of as a sort of very advanced, powerful tool. But what there actually was in the GIS database is a point referring to a break that had a link to this document. You can't search that. If you had an Excel spreadsheet, for example, that said, break, and the next field over was a link to this document, you can't search based on any of the criteria that you are capturing here. This is another piece from the same system. This is sort of the more modern version. And what you have here is essentially a PDF sheet that's created out in the field that tracks this data. Now, the good thing about this is what this system is actually doing now that they've got this PDF sheet is they're converting the data from these PDFs into an Excel spreadsheet that they can actually sort on. So they're sort of stepping toward getting all of that information actually into the GIS database. Now that I've got that in one searchable format, I can organize that and do searches on it either on an Excel base or put it into a database and use it that way, or put it into a GIS system, which is a geographic database, so that I can not only do the queries and the searches but also visualize the data. Basically what I'm getting at here is use formats that you can search and sort. GIS is king, but it's also often quite expensive, although there are free open source programs out there. But a work order database that you can pull queries and pull data out of is great. Excel can work, and you can do it on paper as long as you're organized. Last step, gathering data. I've been talking about GPSing and GIS. You got to get the GPS coordinates somewhere. Address is good, GPS coordinates are better. How do you get them? Good news is there are a lot of ways, some of which are cheap, some of which are expensive, but some of which are actually free. If you're just starting out and don't want to invest a lot of money, one thing to think about is the fact that you are probably walking around with a GPS receiver in your back pocket right now. This is sort of the low budget version. Most smartphones these days have a basic GPS chip in them. Now, granted, the accuracy isn't pinpoint. They're typically plus or minus 3 meters or so. But if you're in an urban location, often it's a little bit better than that. DSLR cameras are also starting to come with built-in GPS chips. So if you're taking pictures of your breaks and you turn on the location services for your camera, one of the pieces of information that you can capture is the GPS coordinates where you're standing when you took the picture. So these are a couple of images. The left side is from a Mac, the right side is from a PC. But what you can see there is that there are lat and longe coordinates there, and further up that file is altitude as well. So, these are 3 useful pieces of information that you could document just simply off a photo. That information is stored in what's called an EXIF file, and you don't even have to download your photos to get to this information. There are free viewers out there that will let you look at your picture and give you the different pieces of metadata about it, including GPS and altitude. This happens to be a fire hydrant right outside our building, and using a free app called EXIF Viewer Lite, I've got access to the GPS coordinates right here. It's a little bit cumbersome because I got to type that data into a spreadsheet or something else to use it, but the data is there for me to use. It's low tech and it's free. You can also look at different kinds of base maps. So you probably noticed in the earlier version I had a street base map. This is showing me that point in a satellite-based map. You could literally open up Google Maps, drop a point on the location that you're at, and share it and with yourself, essentially text that to yourself, and you will see part of what gets shared is the GPS coordinates. So there's a lot of different ways to get that basic locational data that are free. Sort of the next step up from that is using a GNSS or GPS survey, or GNSS is basically just using the American GPS satellites and the European and Russian counterparts. You can tether one of these devices to your phone and replace your plus or minus 3 meter accuracy with the accuracy of your surveyor. But if you're going to do this, you might as well just go ahead and jump to a tablet-based app, because if you're doing this stuff by hand, you're having to transfer data. When you transfer data, you have the issue of formats. You may have a situation where different people are putting data in, the same information in different ways. So if I've got a bunch of information that has a month in it, I could be writing January, I could be writing Jan. All of those are legitimate ways of doing it. But if I were to search on January, I'd only find 2 of those records. Consistency really matters. So using apps to help do your data collection is a great way to make sure that your data is consistent and lets you design your data collection scheme in a way that really works well for you. So we use phone and tablet based collection apps in our own mapping processes. The one that we use frequently is called Fulcrum. It's relatively cheap. There are many others out there that do the same thing. So you can look around, but it's basically a $25 a month service where I've got software on my tablet. I use a handheld GPS that is tethered to that device. And I use that to collect my data. And the nice thing about Fulcrum and other units of its ilk is that assuming you've already got a phone, for somewhere between $200 and $600, you can buy yourself a suitable GPS device, and at $25 a month, you can track this information and any other sort of point location information you want about your system. It works really simply. It's highly configurable. You can build your own apps. They have a bunch of pre-built apps, but this is a screenshot from their website showing just a pipe break tool that we were putting together, and you can see it's basically sort of a drag and drop kind of thing where you pull information fields from here over into this side and then use that information or those fields to define what you want. So here, for example, under break type, we've defined a bunch of choices. And then when we upload that to our app, this is a screenshot of the iPad that's running this app. You can see the exact same choices are there. This is really great because it's highly configurable, and you can change how you're collecting data over time as you get better at it or find that there are new issues. But it also makes sure that everybody is collecting all of the data in the exact same way, so that when you start to getting to those analysis stages, you are not worrying about whether one person wrote January and the other person wrote 01. This happens to be another screenshot from Fulcrum. This is basically just showing where that specific record is. It's the one that's listed up there. This is a bird's eye view of the quad behind our engineering building. But you can see the accuracy of these things is basically as good as the accuracy of your GPS device. The ones that we have typically do about a meter, and that's plenty good enough. There are obviously other options. If you're already in a GIS environment and haven't checked it out yet, I highly recommend looking into Collector for ArcGIS. You know, it's got a little bit more of a steep learning curve. It's not quite as easy to build things in it as it is in Fulcrum and some of these other sort of more universal type apps, but it is tightly integrated with ArcGIS Online and ArcMap. So if you already have that kind of environment, using this kind of collector app, which essentially does the same things as Fulcrum does, will really help with your data collection process. What I'm showing you here is a device that I have not managed to get my hands on yet, but I'm trying to. It's a Trimble Catalyst. It's basically a receiver, costs about $350, and it's designed also to tether with a phone. It only works on Android devices, and it's a monthly subscription-based model where you essentially buy the receiver and then you pay a monthly subscription for the software that interpolates the receiver's results, and your cost is based on the accuracy that you want. So they've got anything from, you know, a meter down to a centimeter's accuracy. Downside is it's Android only, and not all of the United States is covered at that, you know, finite centimeter level, but meter accuracy is more than good enough for most of the stuff that I've been talking about here. And here's just a couple of screenshots of what Collector looks like. You know, this is actually an app that ArcGIS has available for you. It's called the Leak Investigator. It has some basic information on the idea behind this is that this would be sort of the first step in evaluating a leak. So, you know, in this case, you can see it's a critical leak. There's some comments, shut down when I collected that information, and that red box there is actually a service outage area that I drew in. You know, again, these are really useful tools. There is a little bit of a learning curve to them, but these can really be worked into your workflow very, very easily. And the benefits of doing this kind of information or this kind of data collection and review is really, really useful. Last couple of things about storing data, kind of touched on this already. You know, store it in formats that you can analyze. You know, recognize that the formats that you're using today may not be the ones that you're using tomorrow, and that's okay. The good thing about a lot of these data collection apps is that they can give you the same information in a lot of different formats. So for example, with Fulcrum, if I was using Excel to do some basic analysis myself, I can download all of my break information in Excel, but I could also download it in a Google Map file, a KML file, or an Esri shape file that I could then pass off to a consultant who was going to do some work for me. So make sure that the data that you're collecting is in a format that you can actually analyze. So with that, I'm going to just have a couple of closing remarks. You know, break data is obviously only just one of the pieces of your system's analytical puzzle, but if you can work break data collection and analysis into your existing workflow, I think that the knowledge you gain about your system will be really, really useful, and you'll find that you can leverage that knowledge in a lot of different ways, many of which can have significant impacts on your financial bottom line, both in terms of the money you're spending and the money you might be outlaying for operations like O&M. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left here. I'm perfectly willing to go over any questions that we don't get to during this Q&A session. We will answer in a follow-up email. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Haley. She's been monitoring questions that have been coming in and see if there's any I can actually answer for you.
We have a couple of questions here, and again, feel free to keep submitting questions. If we can't get to them, we will email you with some answers. We'll probably go about 5 to 10 minutes over, but if you would like to stay, some of these questions might be helpful for you. So James, the first one is, do you use criteria other than brakes to replace pipes?
Yeah, you would. Um, but I like to focus on brakes because that's one of the easily accessible things that I can look at. Water quality issues might be indications that you're having pipe deterioration. There are other criteria. Like I said, I think brakes are only a piece of the puzzle, but they are an important piece of the puzzle.
Great. So the next one is, what do you feel is the best yet most inexpensive way to record underground distribution and transmission line data?
So I'm going to assume what you mean by that is, how am I going to map the pipe itself, as opposed to incident data. Um, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. If you want to do it accurately, you're going to need ground penetrating radar. One of the ways that we work out pipe location is by finding the valves and the meters first and sort of extrapolating from that. And then again, brakes can often fill in the pieces in between. So if that's what you're referring to, that's my answer. If you're referring to the actual, like, what sort of software do I use to record and analyze this, I really like using ArcGIS. It's kind of the industry standard. That being said, it is relatively expensive. There are open source free GIS programs out there. There's one called Quantum GIS, or now I think they've changed the name to actually QGIS. Is a little less user-friendly, but has a really big user base that are constantly building tools. So if you wanted to get into the GIS world in an inexpensive way, that is a great way to do it. You may actually already have a work order database in place that records a lot of this information. Obviously, there are hundreds of different kinds of work order databases, but one thing you might look into is using something like Crystal Reports or SQL queries to actually mine into your existing work order system to pull out information that way. I'm not sure if I answered the question. I'll look at that again in the written format and see if I can come up with a little bit slightly more concise version. Or if I didn't quite answer that correctly, feel free to throw out another version of that question.
Sounds good. So changing paths a little bit, where would you start with goal setting?
That is a really broad question. And I think, again, that's sort of a contextual thing. I like to go for low-hanging fruit because I think developing momentum is a really useful thing. But I also am very interested in knowing what my customers want. Albuquerque is really good at this. They have periodic meetings with their customer bases. If you're a smaller system, you might have, open public meetings. I tend to start with the issues that my customer base is concerned about. So, if my customers are concerned about water quality, that's what I'm going to focus on. If I've got a lot of complaints about leaks not being repaired quickly, that's what I'm going to focus on. There's always going to be issues about rates. But the nice thing about doing this kind of data collection is it gives you data points to show what it is you're doing. I'm always amazed at the job that water operators and water systems do in the background. The average person out in a neighborhood does not have any clue what the water system is doing. Collecting information like this basically shows or gives you the opportunity to show your customers what you're doing with their dollars. I mean, in a nutshell, we're making sure that everybody doesn't die of cholera. But quite frequently, the comments that people get when somebody does a tour of a water plant is, oh my God, I had no idea what you guys ever do. All I do is see you drive. All I ever see you is driving around in trucks. So I would say focus on the things that your customers are concerned about, and focus on things that are going to help you improve improve your system. I like to look at breaks from a financial standpoint, but also from a water loss standpoint, because those are sort of the two things that I tend to geek out about. But the concerns that your system have may be slightly different. If I'm gearing up for a big capital improvement plan, that's where I'm going to put my focus.
Maybe let's do 2 more questions. The next one is there a key, descriptive, and or photo for identifying certain types of breaks and their failure mechanism that you know of?
I do not. That's actually something that we've been working on gathering for ourselves. That little app that I showed you that we were working on in Fulcrum is part of that. There are a lot of different papers around that, and one of the things that Don, who was supposed to be my co-presenter today, and I are working on is developing an attribute table, sort of a list of the basic attributes that you want to track, and then the next step for us is going to be sort of breaking down the individual pieces in that. So I do not have a definitive list. That being said, I think the AWWA has a lot of information about this. They've also got some, average break rate information and things like that that you can use if you want to sort of compare how your system is doing to other systems.
Great, and I also have a comment from an attendee that says the AWWA publishes some good benchmark data for a starting point on performance indicators, KPIs, just to let everybody know.
Yeah, the AWWA is a great source of information. I highly recommend spending some time on their website if you haven't been there. There's a lot of, standard operating procedures and benchmark guides that can be purchased through there. Covering pretty much every aspect of water system operation. So highly recommend you looking into those.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. Again, there are a couple that we did not get to, so we will get back to those attendees and answer those questions via email. The last question is an attendee wants to collect data to help quantify water loss estimates. How do they best describe the actual break?
How do you describe the break? I would focus on the type of break. Is it a circular blowout? Is it a crack? Is it a longitudinal crack? Circular or longitudinal, because there are different formulas that you can use to calculate water loss based on the type of break. So, for example, if you're looking at a circular crack, you want to know what's the size of the pipe and what percentage of the pipe is cracked. Is it split all the way around or just partially? If it's a longitudinal crack, you want to know how long the crack is. Also, has it actually split open? Because basically all of these different flow formulas rely to some degree on the area of pipe that is missing. So that's kind of, the first thing that you want to focus on. To make really good estimates, you're gonna have to know what the pressure is in that part of the system. This is why it's for one of the reasons that it's really good to develop a hydraulic model of your system, or to periodically look around and take pressure readings in different parts of your system. And this could be something that you could do potentially after the fact, after you've got the system all flushed. You're probably flushing out of a hydrant somewhere near the break. If you've got a pressure gauge, you can slap on there and figure out what the static pressure is. You can use that, and again, one of these readily available formulas to begin to do water loss estimates. That being said, recognize that when your leak was reported is not necessarily the time that it started. So what you're probably going to end up with is a sort of minimum estimate of loss as opposed to a maximum estimate of loss. I think some of operators with a lot of experience might be able to gauge, based on what's going on around the leak, how long it might have been running. But from a sort of a concrete standpoint, you've got report date to isolation date as sort of your basic standpoint. But really, it's the area of the hole, what's the pressure, and depending on the type of pipe, there are a couple of different coefficients that go into that. But again, I think the AWWA has some useful information on that. And Google is your friend. There are a lot of flow rate formulas for different kinds of pipe out there, and the kind of pipe actually does matter. So the flow rate out of a broken cast iron pipe is going to be slightly different than the flow rate out of a drilled PVC pipe or something like that. But pressure, size of break, those will get you going.
Great. Well, Tess, I think we're done with the question portion of the presentation.
Awesome. So there's just one last kind of housekeeping thing to get through. We just want to ask you if you'd like to subscribe to our blog. We alluded to this at the beginning of the presentation. This is a blog with success stories from small systems that we've helped with technical assistance and some other topics. So I'm going to give you just a couple seconds to respond so we can get you out of here. All right, I'm closing this one. And then lastly, here's a question we always ask. Are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance for your small water system? This is a service that we can provide through our small systems project, and it's a way for, if you're eligible, that someone like James can help you, maybe do some of this stuff. No promises, but this is a great way, if you want to get a project like this started. Sorry, James, to volunteer you. That's not
No, that's what we do, training and technical assistance. So feel free to contact me.
All righty, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And on that note, you should have all received an evaluation link. And other than that, I think we can close this up for today. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you for attending.